Now then guys, in this video we're going to discuss training to failure. So what we're going to include is we're going to talk about some terminology around training to failure. We're going to talk about what the research suggests at the moment. We're going to talk about my experience and thoughts on the topic. We're going to talk about some techniques that you can use around where you are in relation to failure. We'll then talk about when it's potentially appropriate or not appropriate, again in my opinion. And finally we'll just look at some considerations to make in applying or not applying the concept of training to failure. Okay, so first of all we'll look at these, or we'll discuss this terminology. So on the one hand you've got training to technical failure, on the other hand you've got training to absolute failure. Okay, technical failure is basically where you have a breakdown in technique in the slightest. So for example, if you are not able to maintain a position, or the positions that you want in the movement, or if you have an obvious loss in velocity, tempo of the movement, then you have met technical failure. So if we take a back squat as an easy example, performing a back squat, let's say you get to the point where you're feeling a bit of a shift to one side, or you're getting to a point where you're feeling that the bar's slowing down the way up, or you're limiting your depth compared to the first few reps, then you've hit technical failure. Okay, soon as that starts to encroach and that becomes aware, or coach notices it, or your training partner notices it, then you've hit technical failure. Okay, obviously moving beyond that, you're going past technical failure. If you stop just before that, so you think, okay, I'm at the top of this rep, I feel like I'm gonna not be able to perform this rep at the same tempo, let's say, then you would be stopping just before technical failure. On the other hand, we have absolute failure. So with absolute failure, essentially we're going to the point where we're not able to perform the movement. So if we take the squat again, let's hope you'd have spotters here, or at the very least you're able to safely bail from the squat, safely let the bar fall behind you. But let's say with absolute failure, you're coming down and then you're not able to drive back up for whatever reason, whether that's a loss in position, whether you just don't have it in you to get up, you've then hit absolute failure. Okay, in the example of like a machine exercise or an isolated exercise like a bicep curl, let's say, you're getting to the point where you're not able to lift that weight up to the full range of motion. Okay, or pretty much not all. And you'll know what that feels like if you've done your curls. Okay, so they're the two bits of terminology. So we'll just quickly look at what the research says now. Now I've made a Google Drive folder with about 5 or 6 papers in, tried to get some recent ones. So you can go through them and have a look if you're interested. But essentially, you can break it into hypertrophy, strength and power. Okay, starting with power, it seems that you should not train to failure. Power is about moving as fast as possible, moving the object or moving yourself as fast as possible. So training to failure is obviously not going to help that, because you're practicing moving at a lower velocity with less power than what you'd want to be. So essentially, if you're going to failure, even to the point where you sort of going towards technical failure, if there's any loss in velocity, then you're not really going to be training at the same level of power. So essentially for power, it seems quite obvious that you don't want to be training to failure. So you might be using things like long rest periods, things like cluster sets, in order to make sure that you can get the adequate volume in but still move with that maximal intent. Okay, secondly, looking at strength, it seems that training to failure isn't optimal by any means. Okay, and if you are training just beyond failure, or just before failure, that's probably the optimal level that you want to be doing for strength for the most part. Now obviously it's quite popular for people to be doing assisted reps. So let's say you're doing a bench press and someone's like giving you that assistance on the way up, so you're kind of training over failure. That's quite a popular method for strength training, with the idea being that it's a high motor recruitment that you're going to get from doing that sort of training. And yeah, that may be true. The research suggests that you can sort of train to about 1 to 2 reps in reserve, which we'll discuss in a second, but train just before you get to failure and you're going to get a similar amount of motor unit recruitment. So the idea with strength is that it's not necessary to train to failure, but you obviously want to be getting relatively close. And really it's more important that you're using a heavy enough load and that the volume is adequate. Okay, that seems to be the more important variable when you're training strength, volume and the adequate load, than training to failure. I think as well, with a strength exercise, typically it's going to be a free weight global, like a large compound movement that you're doing in strength training. So there's obviously a lot of room for error, and potentially if you're doing it on your own, the safety risk comes in if you train to failure. Bench press, easy example, say you can't get the bar up. So yeah, it makes sense why you don't necessarily need to train all the way to failure to build strength. And obviously it's quite practical to do that as well, unless you've got always spotters or a training partner with you. Finally, we'll look at hypertrophy / local muscular endurance. So hypertrophy, it seems as though, similar to strength in a sense, that you don't need to train to failure to get optimal gains, but it seems that there's not much of a difference between training to failure versus training just before failure in hypertrophy. Once again, it comes down to the volume. So if you train to failure, but you do less volume, that's probably gonna be less optimal than not quite trained to failure. So maybe like, 8 out of 10, but you've got more volume in there. So it seems as though the volume's more important than the actual getting to failure. However, for local endurance, there was a little bit of research that suggested that training to failure was optimal for local endurance. But whenever you look at the research, you've got to consider what are the training of these people doing. So if you're applying it to yourself, in these studies, the idea is they're not doing any of the training than what's set in the program, which will be specifically a non-failure or failure-based training approach for hypertrophy, strength or power. That's typically all they're doing to control for other variables. So you've got to ask yourself, what are the training are you doing, and how is training to failure or not going to affect that? And also you've got to look at it with the sense of a lot of the populations that they use are moderately to untrained, okay, which might not be you, and also they're looking at quite young participants as well. So sort of around the 18 to early 20s. So again, that might not be you. So it's worth considering that although this research is great, gives you a good idea, it might not be specific to where you're at. Okay, and then just a final consideration, the research was the load used. If you're using light loads for strength and hypertrophy, again, you might not get the same effect, regardless of training to failure or not, as if you're using the heavy loads. So that volume and load seems to be a really important variable. So essentially, from the research, the only takeaway we have towards failure being effective is if you're building local muscular endurance. So local muscular endurance is like, leg extension machine. That will be a local quadricep muscular endurance. It's isolated to one place. That's the local idea. Whereas global would be, maybe like a push-up, okay, or a squat, where you're using a combination of muscles together. So with the research in mind, my experience is that there's such a important emphasis on coordination and skill, even with a relatively simple free weight exercise like an overhead press or a squat or a pull-up. Okay, there's a lot of coordination involved. So for me, if you're always training to pass technical failure, you're not going to be building that coordination, and you're not going to be building that skill of the movement. So because there's such an emphasis on that coordination and skill, I don't really think there's much room for training to anywhere near absolute failure unless it's a very isolated movement. The other consideration that I would think about is what training phase you're in. So let's say you're in a training phase that's about, mass building, okay, and with an isolation exercise, it might feel really good to get the pump, and because most of your exercises are maybe focused in the gym, you're off season, you're not playing rugby or football, maybe you can get away with training to failure in some isolation based exercises and it not have too much an impact on you. And then you've also got to consider what's coming up the next day. So for example, let's say you're doing 5 strength sessions a week, which for me, I would say is a lot. Are you going to be beneficial doing training to failure and then knowing that you've got, let's say it's you doing squats to failure, then you've got like split squats the next day or reverse lunges the next day, or even deadlifts? Like, is it going to be beneficial to be training to failure on that day if you've got then, a relatively intense session the day after? Probably not. Same thing if you're doing concurrent training. Let's say you've got a run the next day that's a priority run that you're trying to do like threshold work or intervals. Again, is it going to be beneficial doing that? Probably not. That's my thoughts and experience from it. We'll then look at what you can use to determine where failure is. If you're doing it yourself, okay, you can use RPE or RIR. So RPE is rate of perceived exertion. Essentially, I just use a 1 to 10 scale, 10 being maximal effort. Okay, again, for me, maximal in this context, unless it's a competition, is you're at technical failure, and then 1 being walking, very, very easy. You can also use RIR, which some people find a lot better, and the research seems to be favouring that as well. RIR is reps in reserve. So for example, a 10 out of 10 RPE would be 0 reps in reserve, and 9 out of 10 RPE would be about 1 rep in reserve, 8 out of 10 about 2 reps in reserve, and so on and so forth. What you can do when you're planning a session is you can say, as a coach, I can say to someone, right, we're going to go for 3 sets of 10 here. I want you to select a load that's going to give you 2 reps in reserve for. So the person would then, okay, do a couple of warm-up sets, okay, maybe 75 kilograms. I can hit 10 reps and I'll have about 2 reps left in the tank. and then you've hit that 8 out of 10 RPE. Okay, so that's a really cool method you can use towards training to failure. So now we'll look at where it's appropriate. Competition, yeah, you know, you're trying to win, so you might go to failure in whatever it is you're doing. You know, if you're powerlifting or Olympic lifting, obviously that's obvious. So that's where obviously failure training is going to be justified, but then you're not training, you're competing, and there's obviously a difference there. Secondly, testing. Okay, I think obviously testing, you want to be pushing to your limits. You've got a score that you can use as a measurement of like, where are you now? Okay, and is this something that you're good at in relation to other things, or is this something that needs to be worked on? So obviously with testing, you want to be making sure that you're training to technical failure. Okay, and then we can also talk, okay, isolated movements. Yes, training to failure might be a bit more reasonable because you're not going to have the same level of fatigue. You're not going to be at a high risk of injury because it's just a single joint and it's very safe to put the weight down or to stop with the machine. So that's where it could be more justified for sure. And then another thing just to mention is like, when are you doing it? So for example, if you're using the isolated exercise and you're going to failure there, you know, I would be doing that following your main exercises. It kind of seems obvious, but you wouldn't really want to come in and do, there is a method called pre-fatigue, probably more a bodybuilding method, but it's definitely got some other context where it could be useful. But you know, if you're doing pre-fatigue, like, would you want to be going to absolute failure or to absolute failure on isolated exercise and then coming and doing back squats? Probably not, if you want to get something out of the back squats from a technical standpoint and, you know, from a maximal strength standpoint. I'll just finish with some final thoughts and considerations. So obviously you've got to consider what is the goal. One thing, coming back to the coordination aspects, you know, if you're learning a sport like Olympic lifting or gymnastics, which is very, very heavily coordination based, then obviously you're going to be failing sometimes. So if someone's practicing a handstand or if someone's practicing a snatch, there is going to be some failed reps. How many is up for debate. Some people reckon about, you know, 80% wants to be there, 20 wants to be failing, so they're still learning, they're still experiencing that failure. It's obviously making it safe. But when it's heavily coordination based, like, someone might hit technical failure, but that might not be, or they might lose technique, but that might not be because they've actually reached some sort of physiological failure. That might just be because they're learning the movement. So you've got to consider that as well. And then, you know, you've also got to consider what is the goal. So if your goal is bodybuilding and hypertrophy training, then, you know, maybe there is more room to train to failure because it's going to give you a good pump. So you might be prioritizing that muscle, so you're going to try and get some extra volume in. But like, if your goal is to be a better runner and you're using squats for S&C, then doing squats to failure probably isn't going to benefit your running that much, because it's not particularly specific. Okay, and then also you've got to consider what are the other training variables. So, you know, potentially more important is that we've got the adequate volume that we want, and that's potentially progressing depending on the phase you're in. And you've got the adequate intensity, the loads there, or the velocities there that you're wanting, the rest periods, the frequency of the session, the frequency of the movements that you're performing, or muscle groups that you're working. So again, if you're doing them 3 or 4 days a week, is it going to be possible to train them to failure? Probably not. Even technical failure, probably not. Okay, because you're going to struggle to come back the next day or the day after and perform the same movements or similar movements to the best of your abilities. So yeah, but hopefully that gives you some insights into how I think about training to failure. As I said, there's the research in the Google Drive folder, which there'll be a link to down below, which you can have a look at. I think it's a really interesting subject, and there's definitely more research that needs to be done to kind of determine, especially with hypertrophy. You know, it's so popular to train to failure with hypertrophy, so it's surprising that it doesn't actually need to be, the research suggests that it doesn't actually need to be done. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed the video, guys, and leave some comments below about what your thoughts are around training to failure, and I'll see you soon. Enjoy your training.